The knocking was loud and urgent, as if it wanted to tear the thick night apart. Outside, the wind howled long on the mountainside, whipping ice and snow against the wooden walls. Each knock was a hammer blow to Elias Ward's chest. He sat up, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun hanging on the wall. No one had ever knocked on the door here. The entire valley was deserted, more than 10 miles from town. A stranger appearing at midnight could only bring bad omens. Elias stood up, walking slowly on the creaking wooden floor, his heartbeat blending with the howling wind like a drumbeat. The knocking came again, more urgent, as if the hand was afraid that if it missed a beat, life would be swallowed by the blizzard. Elias pressed his back against the door, took a deep breath, and then jerked the wooden latch. The door swung open. A cold wind blew in, along with fluttering snowflakes. And on the porch, 5 figures appeared, 5 Apache girls. They stood close together, their shoulders shaking. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted. Her bare feet were bloody, leaving marks on the cold planks. Her eyes were wide open, panicked, but she refused to bow her head. The eldest sister, tall and thin, her black hair disheveled, took a step forward. Even though her lips were purple, her voice still rang out, hoarse and firm. "We will work, we will cook, we will serve. Just let us in." At that moment, the cabin froze. Elias clenched his jaw. 2 paths echoed in his mind. Close the door, they died in the night. Open the door, he could lose everything. Food, peace, even his life. Behind him, the wind howled long like the urging of fate. 5 pairs of eyes looked at him. The second sister, her eyes like daggers, glanced at the gun on the wall. The third sister hugged her empty cloth bag tightly, still trying to stand straight. The fourth sister squeezed her shoulders, trembling. And the youngest, her bare feet bruised, her lips trembling, her eyes pleading with fear. Elias took a breath, the blood pounding in his ears. Then, his voice broke out, hoarse. "Come in." They rushed through the door like a flood, carrying with them the smell of damp leather, smoke, and despair. The cabin, which was used to being quiet, was now suffocating with the new breath. Elias closed the door, leaned back against the wood, his heart pounding. He pointed to the stove. "There are beans, there is salt meat. Take care of it yourself." The third sister, Tyanita, stepped forward immediately, her movements neat and decisive. Chinoa, the fourth sister, held a knife and sliced the meat thinly, her eyes focused as if afraid of wasting anything. Ahioka, the second sister, remained near the door, her eyes watching Elias like a sentry. Dakota, the youngest, sat close to the fire, her trembling hand stretched out to the embers. Nayeli, the eldest, kept her eyes fixed on Elias, as if to bind him to his decision. The smell of beans and salted meat gradually spread, overpowering the icy smell. Dakota tried to push the bowl toward Elias, but he pushed it away, curtly. "Eat." The girl's eyes were surprised, then filled with tears. The heavy cabin suddenly lightened a beat. They ate in silence. Only the sound of spoons hitting the pot and the wind whistling outside the porch could be heard. Elias observed. These were not parasites. Each had discipline, self-respect. Suffering had taught them how to survive. When the meal was over, they spread old blankets on the floor, huddled close together. Elias stood up, walked to the door. His hand rested on the wooden latch, and then let it fall. The door closed, unlocked. He returned to the table, looking at the 5 figures lying by the fire. The cabin was no longer a fortress of a solitary person. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside, the cold had lost its hold. Elias knew, from the moment he opened the door, life would never be the same again. And if you're following this story, don't forget to leave a little sign, a like, or a comment to let me know where you're listening from. Because this decision, made by a lonely man on a snowy night, will open a series of days that will never be the same again. Dawn filtered through the cracks in the cabin, pale and cold. Elias opened his eyes to a strange feeling. The cabin was no longer as silent as it usually was. The sound of spoons in the pot, the sound of dry wood being stacked, someone whispering softly in Apache. He sat up, his eyes accustomed to the darkness immediately noticing the change. The 5 girls had woken before him. Tyanita stood by the stove, stirring the thin porridge with calloused hands, her gaze so focused that each movement seemed a ritual. Chenoa sat by the narrow window, mending a torn piece of cloth with thread from an old shirt. Dakota hugged a bundle of firewood twice as big as his body, staggering but refusing to let go, his tangled hair covering his bright, stubborn eyes. Near the door, Ahioka folded her arms, her gaze still sharp, watching Elias's every breath. And in the middle of it all, Nayeli, her back straight, directing with a brief glance, a silent leader. Elias stepped down, the wooden floor creaking under his heels. 5 pairs of eyes turned to him. The cabin was small, but now there was something new, collective breathing. He looked at Dakota, his bare feet muddy and bloody. Silently, Elias went to the corner of the room and pulled out a pair of old shoes and a pair of wool socks. He set them on the floor without a word. Dakota blinked, hesitated, then looked at his sister. Nayeli nodded slightly. Dakota's trembling hands held the shoes like treasures. When he tried them on, an innocent smile appeared, the first since they had arrived. The cabin seemed brighter. Ahioka, always tense, paused. That cold gaze wavered for a breath before she turned away. They sat around a simple breakfast, thin porridge with a little salt. Elias took the bowl, but saw that they had divided the small portion into 6, leaving him the largest. He frowned, pushing the bowl toward Nayeli. Eat. Her voice was harsh, but heavy as a rock. She hesitated, then took it slowly, her eyes softening slightly. After the meal, the cabin echoed with small but strange sounds to Elias. The sound of needles, the sound of wood being split, the clanking of pots and pans. It was no longer an empty silence, but the silence of work and survival. As the afternoon wore on, Elias stepped out to the fence, his axe hitting the logs. He heard light footsteps behind him. He turned and saw Nayeli standing there, thin in her frayed skirt, her dark eyes fixed on him. She spoke slowly, her English broken. The village, burned. The people were all gone. Elias gripped the handle of the axe. He didn't ask any more. He didn't need to. He had seen it before: fire, screams, bodies, the final silence. Nayeli didn't need to finish, he knew. They were survivors. As night fell, the cabin was quiet. The girls huddled around the fire, breathing steadily. Elias stepped to the door, his hand on the wooden latch. A beat, and then it let go. It was unlocked. He turned back, looking at the 5 sleeping figures. The cabin was no longer a shelter for one person. From that moment on, it had its first communal fire, not just of wood, but of a dawning faith. The next morning, light filtered through the cracks in the planks, casting long streaks across the floor. Elias sat up, instinctively accustomed to the silence, but the cabin was different now. It was no longer the sound of his heart beating in the empty room, but the soft sounds of life. Tyanita had lit the fire, the smell of boiling beans permeating the air. Chenoa was busy mending her shirt, each stitch of the needle stretching patiently. Dakota squatted beside the bundle of firewood, trying to arrange it in a straight line, his face wrinkled with concentration. Ahioka was still standing near the door, her cold eyes fixed on Elias, but her hand no longer gripped the knife as tightly as before. Nayeli sat by the stove, her back straight, her eyes following her siblings, then turned to look at Elias, as if waiting to see if he would accept their presence. Elias walked over, silently observing. He realized the cabin, which had been full of wood, dust, and silence, had now changed. From those hands, it had become a place with a shared breath. Dakota staggered, clutching the bundle of firewood that was too big. Elias frowned, then stood up, taking another old shoe from the corner of the cabin, worn leather, but still sturdy. He handed it to her. The youngest girl's eyes widened, shining, her mouth breaking into a trembling smile. The cabin seemed to have another ray of sunshine. Nayeli watched silently. When Elias turned back, her eyes met his silently, both grateful and probing. When breakfast was over, Elias sat at the table, carving a log with a knife in his hand. Nayeli suddenly spoke, her voice slow and broken, but each word was like a stone thrown straight into the silence. The village, burned. The people were gone. Elias stopped. He didn't ask, didn't press. He knew that behind that short sentence was a sea of blood and tears. He looked down at their feet, cracked, bruised, no shoes, no socks. He understood everything. At night, the girls curled up by the fire. Elias stepped to the door. His hand rested on the wooden latch, paused. One beat, two beats, and then let it fall. The door closed, unlocked. He turned back, looking at the 5 figures huddled by the fire, breathing evenly. The cabin was no longer a prison of solitude. It was a place of something new, shared survival, woven together by Apache hands and a man used to living alone. That afternoon, the wind blew through the valley, carrying a biting cold. Elias was chopping wood outside the fence, sweat mixed with the icy wind on his skin. The sound of the axe hitting the wood was loud and decisive, but he knew that behind him there was a gaze boring straight into him. Ahioka. She stood against the porch pillar, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes as sharp as a knife. Unlike Dakota's trembling or Chenoa's silence, this gaze was as heavy as a wordless interrogation. "You didn't lock the door," she said, her voice short and concise. Elias stopped, his gray eyes lingering on the tense face. There was a long silence. Then he answered, his voice hoarse. "No need." The words were few, but they rang out like an oath. At that moment, the wind blew hard, sending dusty snow flying into both of their faces. Elias didn't dodge, and Ahioka didn't blink. They stood like 2 gatekeepers, measuring each other in silence. Then she turned away and walked inside. But Elias knew her suspicion had not receded. Night fell, the cabin was bustling with meals. Tayanita was stirring the pot of bean and corn soup. Dakota was giggling as he blew on the hot spoon. Chenoa was busy sewing her shirt. Only Ahioka sat against the wall, her eyes never leaving Elias. Nayeli, the eldest sister, saw it. She gently placed her hand on her sister's shoulder, her eyes signaling, "Don't worry." But that cold gaze was still as tense as a bowstring, not letting go. When dinner was over, Elias stood up and walked to the door. The whole cabin seemed to hold its breath. His hand rested on the wooden latch. For a moment, then he pulled it back. The door was closed, unlocked. Dakota chuckled softly under the blanket. Tayanita and Chenoa exchanged a relieved look. Nayeli nodded slightly, her eyes softening. Only Ahioka sat still, her eyes as sharp as coals, silently keeping watch over the entire cabin. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, warmth spread, but the string of suspicion remained taut, signaling that the storm of emotions had not yet subsided. The night fell heavily. The snowstorm whistled through the ravine, pouring cold air into the cabin. The fire in the stove crackled, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. The 5 girls huddled close to the stove, but Elias remained at the table, a small knife in his hand carving a piece of juniper. The clack, clack sound of the blade echoed evenly, trying to dispel the chaos in his heart. The cabin was suffocatingly quiet. Then a figure separated from the group, approaching the table. Nayeli. A slender figure, a gaunt face, but her eyes still shone like hot coals. She stood opposite Elias, silently watching his hand. The knife still made each slow stroke. Then, unexpectedly, she placed her hand on the piece of wood, right where he was touching. Their fingers lightly touched. The moment was brief, but in the quiet cabin, it sounded like thunder. Elias paused. His breathing became heavier, his heart pounded, hard and fast. Nayeli did not pull her hand away. The black eyes were frank, not pleading, not trembling, only a strange pride, mixed with an undisguised pain. Elias looked into her eyes, saw a mountain of burden, loss, despair, but also stubborn vitality. It had been a long time since he had looked at anyone like that. In the corner of the room, Ahioka raised her head. Her sharp eyes flashed when she caught that moment, but she did not speak. She just looked, then closed her eyes, remaining silent. Dakota was asleep, breathing evenly. Tayanita and Chenoa still pretended to be busy, but their hands paused, admitting that they had seen everything. Nayeli withdrew her hand. But in that moment, Elias knew. An invisible door had opened. He put the knife down on the table, exhaled deeply. No longer the man who had been hiding, he had just taken another step into the world he had locked away. As the girls curled up in their blankets, Alias walked to the door, hands on the wooden latch, familiar. A beat, then release. No lock. But this time, it was more than a decision to protect their survival. It was an acceptance. A small spark had ignited in the darkness, and he had left it in the cabin with him. Outside, the wind was still howling. But in the cabin, the silence was no longer empty. It had a shared breath, the beginning of something deeper. Night covered the valley, the wind howled through the ravines, blowing ice and snow against the cabin roof. Inside, the fire crackled, illuminating the figures huddled around the flames. But Elias sat at the table, his hand clutching the small knife, splinters of wood scattered across the tabletop. He was chiseling not because he needed the hammer handle, but to control the turmoil in his heart. The turmoil that had begun the moment Nayeli's fingers touched his. The cabin seemed quiet, but one pair of eyes was still open. Nayeli. She was not asleep. She sat close to the stove, her back straight, her dark eyes silently watching Elias. The fire reflected in her eyes like two embers, not burning fiercely, but persistently, refusing to go out. After a while, she stood up. Her steps were light but determined, passing her 4 younger brothers wrapped in blankets. She stopped in front of the table. Elias looked up, his gray eyes and his black eyes meeting, so tense that the air seemed to stop. You? Her voice was hoarse, broken, her English awkward. Kept us? Out of pity? The question hit Elias like a hammer blow. He put the knife down on the table, looked straight at Nayeli. His heart was pounding, but his voice was low and steady. No, I didn't send you away. The silence that followed was thick, only the crackling of wood in the stove. Then, as if pulled by an invisible string, they leaned in together. Lips touched. The first kiss, hesitant, trembling, but carrying the weight of so many things not dared to say. It wasn't rushed. It was careful, slow, like 2 survivors seeking warmth in a cold night. Elias paused, but didn't pull back. His heart was pounding, his breathing was erratic. As for Nayeli, her hands were on the table, trembling, but her eyes were bright when they left his lips, no longer doubtful. A brief moment, but enough to turn Elias's closed world upside down. In the corner of the room, Ahioka opened her eyes. Her sharp eyes flashed when she saw the scene. But unlike usual, she did not rush to stop him. She just observed, then slowly closed her eyes. Silence, acceptance, or at least, no objection. Dakota breathed evenly, curled up like a kitten. Chinoa and Tyanita, pretending to sleep, their hands still stiff in the blanket. They had heard, had felt, but chose to be silent. Nayeli returned to her place, lying down next to her siblings. She said nothing. Elias remained motionless, his eyes glued to the fire. But his hand on the table was still hot, as if it had retained the warmth of her hand. He stood up, walked to the door. His hand rested on the wooden latch. A moment, then he let go. Unlocked. This time, it was more than a familiar gesture. It was a silent admission. From now on, the cabin was no longer just a shelter. It had become the place where his heart began to tremble again. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside, the silence was no longer empty. It held a new secret, a kiss in the dark, opening up a chain of tomorrows that could not be returned to the way they were before. At noon, the sky was covered with heavy gray clouds. Elias was mending a fence, each hammer blow hitting the wooden posts with a dry sound. The distant sound of horse hooves made him stop. In this part of the country, the sudden appearance of someone was as rare as thunder in the winter sky. A figure on horseback appeared, approaching along the icy road. His frayed leather jacket was covered in dust, a gun hung loosely at his side. Elias recognized him immediately. Jonas Harker, the neighbor from 10 miles away, a drinker, a gossip, and a nose for gossip. In the cabin, 5 Apache girls. If Harker saw, the news would spread throughout the town, and then there would be no place for them to survive. Inside, now, Elias said curtly. Nayeli pulled the girls in immediately, her dark eyes flashing with worry. Ahioka hesitated, her hand gripping the knife. Elias growled, low but sharp as steel. Go. Finally, she backed into the shadows. Harker stopped his horse before the fence. His eyes narrowed, scanning the cabin. Ward, I see the fire is burning brighter than usual these past few nights. Could it be? You have a visitor? Elias stood up straight, his broad shoulders blocking the door. His voice was deep and steady as steel. Alone, as usual. Harker took a breath, snorted. I hope so. You know, the townspeople don't like to see Indians around here. There are rumors of Apaches escaping the camp. If anyone harbors, he trailed off, spitting on the ground, letting the wind carry the rest away. Inside the cabin, the five girls pressed against the wall. Dakota clutched her eldest sister's skirt, her lips trembling. Chenoa hugged her, whispering comfort. Ahioka held her knife close to her chest, ready like a night wolf. Tyanita was silent, but her eyes were anxious. Nayeli stood straight, her lips pressed together, her eyes piercing the wood to see Elias. Elias kept his gaze fixed on Harker. There are always rumors. There's nothing but snow and rotten wood here. Harker smiled faintly, his eyes still suspicious. But after a few beats, he pulled on the reins and turned the horse. Hold the door, Ward. This winter is prone to trouble. His figure disappeared around the slope. Elias let out a breath, his shoulders heaving. He entered the cabin. 5 pairs of eyes immediately turned to him, tense as a bowstring waiting to snap. Elias nodded briefly. Gone. Dakota burst into tears, sobbing loudly. Chenoa hugged her tightly. Ahioka lowered her knife, but her eyes kept on Elias, examining every move. Nayeli stepped closer, placing her hand on his shoulder. She didn't speak, but the trembling in her eyes said it all. They had just escaped a blade. That night, the cabin was filled with air. There was no longer a hollow silence, but a soft laugh as Dakota listened to Elias's clumsy retelling of an old story. Tyanita smiled, Chenoa sewed. Ahioka sat closer to the fire. In the darkness, the wind still howled outside, but in the cabin they shared a great secret and knew that sooner or later more dangers awaited. For Elias, it was clear for the first time. The cabin was not just his fortress. Now it was a citadel that protected 5 other lives, and his heart. That night, the wind whistled through the cracks in the planks, making the fire in the stove flicker. The small cabin was filled with breath, but the cold still clung to her, seeping into her skin, making all 5 girls shiver. Takata wrapped her blanket around herself, but still shivered. Chenoa rubbed her hands, breathing heavily to warm her cracked fingers. Tyanita hugged the bundle of dry wood, adding fire, but the acrid smoke made her eyes red. Ahioka sat close to the door, her eyes alert, but her shoulders also trembled with each gust of wind. Nayeli, the eldest sister, kept her posture straight. She tried to appear tough, her lips pressed tightly together, but the purple at the corners of her lips betrayed the gnawing cold. She did not complain, did not beg. She just endured silently. Elias watched, his jaw clenched. He knew that the wood was not enough to warm her through the winter. Suddenly his eyes stopped at the corner of the cabin, where there was an old wooden chest, which he had not opened for many years. Slowly, he walked over. His hand rested on the lid of the box, pausing as if touching an old wound. Inside, there was still a piece of memory he had held tightly as the only thing left of his previous life. Elias took a deep breath and opened the lid. Inside was a thick wool coat. The fabric was faded, the threads frayed, but the shape of his late wife's hands that had patched it up was still there. He had kept it like a piece of his heart. Elias lifted the coat and walked toward Nayeli. 5 eyes immediately followed him. He said nothing, just gently placed the coat on his eldest sister's shoulders. Nayeli was startled. Her hands trembled as she clutched the hem of the coat, her dark eyes wavering. Tears welled up, but she tried to hold them back. This was more than a coat. This was faith. A silent recognition that she and her siblings had a place in this cabin. Dakota smiled, cheering softly when she saw her sister was warm. Tyanita nodded slightly, relieved. Chenoa murmured a word of thanks in Apache, and Ahioka her gaze wavered. In a breath, the coldness melted away, replaced by silent acceptance. Nayeli looked up, her eyes, sparkling in the firelight, fixed on Elias. No thanks needed. Just a slow nod, like a promise. We trust you. That night, the wind still howled, the fire still burned. But the cabin was no longer a makeshift shelter. It had become the beginning of a fragile but strong faith, lit by an old coat and a giving hand. Day after day, winter still did not leave the valley. Ice covered the stream. The wind whipped the fences so that they shook as if they were about to break. But inside the cabin, there was another warmth besides the fire, a warmth that seeped into every glance between Elias and Nayeli. During the day, Elias went to the fence, hammering new stakes, repairing the breaks. Nayeli often followed silently. She did not say much, just stood close by, watching his every move. When Elias offered her the hammer, she tried to hold it, awkwardly at first, but firmly. He held her hand, showing how to grasp it. Their hands touched again, not trembling, but sure. Ahioka watched from afar, her eyes like coals. Elias knew that if he accidentally hurt Nayeli, she would be the first to resist, but he did not back down. He let Nayeli continue to study, continue to stand by his side, as if that was the only place she deserved to belong. That night, the cabin was quiet. The fire in the hearth was blazing, shadows gathering in the corners. Elias sat at the table, chiseling wood. Nayeli moved closer, closer than ever. Her hand rested on the piece of wood he was sharpening, her gaze determined. No, pity. She spoke slowly, her English broken, but her voice firm. Elias looked up, looking straight into her eyes. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his voice was deep and clear. Number. Nayeli did not hesitate. She leaned down. The second kiss came, long, sure, and full of determination. There was no hesitation like before. Just two people, tied together by an invisible thread that had just been tightened. Tyanita and Chenoa glanced at each other, then continued sewing, silently acknowledging. Takota chuckled, covering his mouth, innocent as a child. Ahioka stared, her gaze hard, but did not rush forward. She just closed her eyes, holding the knife in her hand, as a silent warning, if you betray me, I will know. While everyone was asleep, Elias opened another chest in the corner of the room. He took out a rough piece of juniper wood and placed it on the table. Each stroke of the knife, each grind, revealed the shape of a small cradle. He did not tell anyone, working quietly in the night. Nayeli woke up, caught him. She stood silently watching, breathing heavily. Her black eyes were sparkling, both surprised and moved. Not because of the shape of the cradle, but because she understood. Elias no longer considered them passers-by. He was building a future. She approached, her hand gently placed on his shoulder. Elias looked up, meeting those eyes shining with tears. He said nothing. No need. They both knew this was no longer pity or responsibility. This was love, rooted in the cold, bursting into a new flame. That night, the wind howled outside, but in the cabin, the fire burned brighter than ever. And in Elias's heart, another fire burned, the fire of love, unquenchable. Winter began to crack. The snow on the slopes melted, revealing dark soil and tender grass. The stream beside the cabin flowed, stronger after weeks of silence. Elias knew that when the mountain roads were open, the town would be filled with rumors again, and the question would come, are they staying or going? The cabin had changed in the past few days. Tyanita made a meal out of a few beans, surprising Elias by finding that she ate better than she had when she was single. Chenoa turned a rag into a thick blanket, her skillful hands patching it together like a weave of hope. Takota trotted over with the old shoes Elias had given him, his smile lighting up the room. Even Ahioka, though she still sat at the door with a wary gaze, had relaxed her grip on the knife. Nayeli, however, was quieter than usual. She followed Elias to the fence, her eyes following each hammer blow. Sometimes, her eyes seemed to ask what he dared not admit. When spring comes, will we still have a place here? Elias kept silent, afraid that one wrong word would ruin everything. Late afternoon, the red sun slid down behind the mountains. Elias was chopping wood when Nayeli approached, slim but determined. She put her hand on the axe handle as he lowered it. Their breaths mingled in the chilly air. Elias. Her voice was hoarse, broken but certain. "We stay." The words echoed like thunder. Elias's chest tightened, then relaxed, letting the heat flow through him. He did not answer, only looked deep into her eyes. In those dark eyes, he saw faith, determination. And he nodded, a nod as heavy as if he had put his life into it. When Nayeli entered the cabin, the girls understood immediately. Dakota cheered, jumped, and hugged her tightly. Chenoa smiled, murmuring a thank you. Tayanita wiped away a tear from the corner of her eye. And Ahioka, after a moment of silence, finally nodded to Elias the first time, slowly but truly. Night fell. Elias walked to the door. His hand rested on the familiar wooden latch. For years, he had locked it tightly to keep the world out. But this time, he let it fall, leaving the door ajar, letting in the spring breeze. No more defenses, no more loneliness. In the cabin, 5 pairs of eyes looked at him. The unspoken truth was clear. They had chosen to stay. And he, Elias Ward, had chosen with them. Spring was slowly but surely coming to the valley. The snow melted away, revealing the moist brown soil where the grasses were sprouting thin green. The once silent stream now murmured, echoing through the crevices of the rocks. Birds returned to the forest, carrying with them the sounds Elias had thought he had forgotten. The cabin had changed too. It was no longer the anxious silence of one person, but the combined breathing of 6 lives. Tayanita rose early, lit the fire, and managed to make a pot of porridge from the few beans. Chenoa mended the blanket, each stitch patient. Dakota trotted out into the yard, his face glowing in the spring sunshine. Ahioka, though still keeping a wary gaze, now sat closer to the stove, her hands busy with the bundle of firewood. And Nayeli, the eldest, often stood beside Elias outside the fence. Her dark eyes watched his every move, learning how to lift the wooden pole, tie the rope. No longer trembling, her hands were called, but her gaze grew steadier. They stood side by side, silent and attached, as if 2 lives were meant to be joined together. One afternoon, Elias brought out the object he had been silently making for many nights. A juniper cradle. The wood grain gleamed in the firelight. The leather straps were soft. The carvings were simple and sturdy. He placed it on the floor, right next to the stove. The cabin fell silent. Takata gasped, his eyes sparkling. Tayanita put her hand to her mouth, holding back a sob. Chenoa whispered a soft thank you in Apache. Even Ahioka froze, her gaze wavering wildly. Nayeli stepped forward, her hand shaking against the cradle. Her eyes were moist, but bright. When she looked up, she looked straight at Elias. Wordlessly, there was recognition in her gaze. He had not only given them shelter, he had given them a future. Elias stepped forward, his cold hand grasping Nayeli's. He spoke softly, his voice as deep as the mountain wind but firm. "We are family." Nayeli nodded. Her smile trembled slightly, but brighter than any fire. That night, the cabin was filled with warmth. The fire burned steadily. Dakota's soft laughter rang out. Ahioka's eyes softened for the first time. The door was unlocked, ajar, letting in the spring breeze and the smell of new earth. Elias looked around. What had once been a lonely fortress was now a warm home. Early the next morning, the dawn was golden over the mountaintop. Elias opened the door, stepped onto the porch. Nayeli was beside him, her hands clasped. They both looked up at the sun pouring down into the valley, the light bathing the cabin in a warm hue. Behind them, smoke from the stove spread evenly, 5 Apache figures busy with their daily chores. Laughter echoed, mixed with the sounds of new life. Elias took a deep breath, his chest filling with a feeling he thought he would never have again. Peace. The man who had locked his door to hide from the world now opened it wide, letting in the wind and light. He was no longer a lone survivor of winter. He was the pillar of a family. And in that dawn, Elias Ward understood that the small cabin in the valley had become a permanent home, a place where no one would have to endure the cold alone anymore. The snow had long since melted from the valley floor when Elias Ward finally stepped outside his cabin, not as a man alone, but as the center of a household that should never have existed and yet did. What began with a single knock on a frozen night ended with a door left unlatched, not out of carelessness, but out of trust. Five Apache sisters, once driven into the wilderness with nothing but their breath, found a place where survival became belonging. And a rancher who once swore he needed no one discovered that solitude was never strength. It was only silence, waiting to be broken. This story, in its heart, is less about the frontier than about the choices that define us. In life, each of us faces that same moment at the door. To close ourselves off for safety, or to open and let in those who might change us. Many listening tonight know what it means to build walls after loss, after betrayal, after years of believing it is easier to walk alone. But like Elias, we may find that healing begins not in what we keep, but in what we give away: a blanket, a place at the table, a piece of trust no one has earned yet. For those in their 40s, 50s, or beyond, perhaps you recognize the echo of your own journey here. Maybe it is a grown child returning home, a neighbor needing shelter after hardship, or simply the courage to let new companionship into your life when you thought the season for it had passed. These are not just tales of the Old West. They are reminders that even in the modern world, family can be chosen, and love can be built in places thought barren. So let this ending linger with you. A cabin in the mountains, its door open to the spring air, smoke curling from the chimney, and laughter inside where once there was only silence. That is the image to carry into your own days. That warmth does not arrive by chance. It is created by the hands that choose to open, not close. And if this story touched something in your heart, take a moment to reflect on the doors you keep bolted and whether it might be time to leave one unlatched. If it stirred you, consider passing the warmth along, share it with someone who needs it, and, if you wish, support this channel with a like, a share, or a subscription. After all, stories such as this are meant to be carried together, just as no one should have to face the winter alone.